All right, well, this is Alex Bryan, President of East West Associates. I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar, Establishing Manufacturing and Sourcing in Vietnam. We've got a full house today, so we kind of jump right into the webinar. I want to first take you all to a brief agenda of how we're going to handle this. We'll have a brief introduction of East West, who we are, and our work in Vietnam. Secondly, we'll have a brief introduction of our upcoming webinar series in the other markets where we're operating, Mexico and Poland and China. Introduce speakers who are seasoned speakers who've been on the ground in Vietnam for quite a while, working with East West and what they're doing and why they're qualified, why they're speaking today. Part 4 will be a brief explanation about Vietnam and why it's on fire right now and the diversification from China. Parts 5 and 6 is going to be a brief overview of ASEAN, but the more detailed discussion on Vietnam. We've got 2 case studies as part of part 7 about our work with 2 U.S. manufacturing companies and what they're doing, 2 U.S. manufacturing companies and what they're doing on the ground in Vietnam. Then we'll get to part 8, which is the Q&A discussion. As our webinars go, some of the people have attended before. A lot of people who are on today are also new, who do not know East West. The way we conduct these webinars, it's going to be primarily mostly all about the Q&A discussion. Parts 1 through 7 will take us about 20 minutes, and then we'll get into the Q&A discussion, which is going to drive for us about 40 minutes. And be driven by the questions we've gotten in from the registrants. I sent a note to everyone who registered asking for questions, and we got quite a large number of them. So I've listed those, and we'll be going through those. I encourage all of you all to ask questions while we're going through this process. If you notice on the control panel on the right-hand side, there's a place there called questions. You click on that, you ask a question and send it to us, and it'll be sent to me, and I'll be able to ask the speakers. So we encourage questions all throughout the webinar while we're doing this, as well as the questions we've got in prior to the today's event. Okay, briefly on East West, we're founded in 2005. We've got all of our executives have had P&L responsibilities and management responsibilities for running multinationals and U.S. companies on the ground in the 5 markets where we play. We're focused on the U.S., China, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, etc. Next area is Mexico, and then Central Eastern Europe, Poland, in that area. Our different executives we all came from different functional skill sets, some operations, supply chain, procurement, HR, but they all end up having P&L responsibilities for running a company on the ground in these different countries, in these different regions. Our services kind of break down into 4 areas: the global manufacturing supply chain footprint, and we'll talk about that in one of the case studies, at least what we're doing in Vietnam for our company. But this is more around plant closures in China, plant relocation from China to Vietnam, Thailand, a lot of plant consolidation in China, and then even plant relocations in China from companies who are getting pushed out of their current business parks or because of urban sprawl. The next area is operational commercial performance. That's really a lot of our M&A due diligence work and assessment work of U.S. companies, their China plants on the ground now, as the companies executives are getting back into their China and Thai, Vietnamese plants. The 4th area is supply chain. That's more identification suppliers, qualification suppliers, supplier transition. And then our human resource service areas, which is more executive search, interim general managers taking over troubled locations. Okay, and here are the 5 areas where we operate. You can see, we talked earlier. Here is, go to this next slide. Here's the webinar series we have coming up. We have several webinars coming up on Mexico. That's supplier identification, qualification, transition, make versus buy, site selection, plant closures, consolidation in China. You all receive invitations to these. We got something coming up on Poland, and then sourcing electronics out of China and Southeast Asia. Okay, let me introduce the speakers here. The 2 speakers we have today are Mark Plum and Jacob Miller. I'm going to ask each of them to give a background on themselves. Mark, if you would start off and give us background and give us your background.
Sure, thanks, Alex. So yes, thanks, guys. I pretty much spent my whole entire working career in and around Asia. I started out in Thailand in 1990 and was vice president of a company called Train Air Conditioning, part of American Standard, then moved up to Shanghai, China. in the mid 90s and pretty much stayed there through 2014. And my last position there was president of Briggs and Stratton, where I had responsibility from Korea to Indonesia and China and everything. So 5, 6 manufacturing facilities, design labs, test labs, a few thousand people. So pretty much understanding the whole general management under manufacturing, production, sales, marketing in Asia, and then joined with Alex in 2014 and been with East West since the last 8, 9 years, working on projects around the world. We've expanded recently out of China because of the China situation, a lot of ASEAN stuff, a lot of Mexico things, and as well as Central and Eastern Europe for those who want to supply Europe out of Central Europe. So anyway, that's kind of my background.
Great. Jacob, why don't you take it next? So Jacob Miller is calling, and he is over in Asia now. Obviously, Jacob lives in Ho Chi Minh. He has some problems sometimes on the connection. So when he is not available, we'll just pick up and run with him, and then Jacob will get back. So Jacob runs our East-West force in Vietnam, resides in Ho Chi Minh, former operations engineer for Caterpillar. His primary focus on supply chain development, procurement process improvements, establishment. He's done a lot of work on the ground in the supply chain sector, particularly in Vietnam now. A lot of our clients either who have U.S. companies have manufacturing. Jacob? Jacob?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, go ahead. I was giving you background. But
yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, I started out my career in Mexico. I spent 9 years in Mexico, primarily doing technology transfer, running small factories in Mexico. After that, I moved on to into China. At the beginning, I was working for Honeywell Aerospace, helping them with moving things between the U.S., Mexico, and China. And then later on, moved into more consulting roles where I'm doing interim management and other things. And then the last 3 years, I've been in Vietnam, primarily doing sourcing, procurement, other things, helping companies establish a foothold in Vietnam and helping them with their China Plus One strategy usually.
Great, thank you. All right, so we'll jump in next to just a brief overview of the current global supply chain and distribution center before we jump into ASEAN. The current state really is this is all around kind of why the diversification from China, why companies are looking at Vietnam, which is now on fire, and really this is most applicable to those who are producing in China for export. It's less applicable to those who are producing in China for China. Although we do have a lot of companies who are manufacturing plants in China, and they're looking to Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, or other locations to find supply chains for them as they're trying to reduce their costs out of China. Obviously, with what's going on in China with the diversification, what's going on in China as far as the tariffs, which do not seem to be going away, right? Labor costs continue to operate. There is some economic nationalism going on. Companies in large part are looking at more nearshoring services, looking more regional supply chain rather than the old model, which is much longer supply chain models. All of that is leading these companies obviously to regionalize and look outside of China. We right now, we don't have a single board of directors or senior executives that are asking us to help them double down in China. We've got some putting in new facilities, but the majority of them are leaving or are not leaving China, but they are diversifying. And why Vietnam, why we've been operating in Vietnam for quite a while and why it's on fire. And so let's kind of then turn our attention now to the ASEAN overview. I'm going to now turn it over to Mark Plum, and Mark, if you will take it from here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so, I mean, I think a lot of people know how big ASEAN is, but I think it's always worth a reminder, excuse me, of the countries and the size of the market. 640 million people. You can see how it fits in as it relates to EU, India, and China. And then with the trade agreements, with trade within ASEAN, trade within ASEAN in China, trade with ASEAN in the USA and Western Europe. For those clients who are in Asia and are selling in Asia, ASEAN is and also for those are in Asia, in China, in selling in an ASEAN, but have the ability to transship a lot of not transship, but ship products of lighter that aren't so concerned about freight costs and things, PCB boards, things of that nature, phones, all that kind of stuff. You can locate those in really some tremendous areas, sell domestically if you're in Thailand or Vietnam, sell within ASEAN, but then equally sell as well as shipping from there back to the USA or Western Europe. So the ASEAN program has really been growing well. Next slide, please, Alex. Yeah, and just kind of a comparison between, and we always these Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines and China, and these are all really change a little bit, but the relative measures are really accurate. So I mean, you can see Thailand is about 60% of what the China costs are, and Vietnam from a labor average salary is about 25-30%. This is interesting. China, as you know, is really heavily top down, so they impose on people there quite a bit of social benefit packages, 30-40%. Vietnam, pretty high, but less so because again of top down, and of course Thailand and Philippines are a little more market driven. And then wage inflation, again, somewhat because of the top down, China is 6 to 12. Vietnam is kind of running kind of similar. Thailand is less so, again, because of market intervention, keeping pricing in line. So again, we'll talk about it as compared to Thailand to Vietnam. Thailand in some areas makes a heck of a lot of sense. In other areas, as in product, I should say, Vietnam makes a tremendous amount of sense. And in both those countries, if you can localize and get local content and you ship to the States, then you can minimize the tariffs back to the States from 25% to something much less. So anyway, good areas to be. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. And then so now I want to introduce Jacob. Jacob, as we mentioned, lives in Ho Chi Minh City. He happens to be in Shanghai this week on some other projects, so that's why his internet, I think, is a little sporadic. Jacob, please.
Yep. Okay, Vietnam has been one of the primary beneficiaries of the China Plus One destinations. A lot of business has been moving to Vietnam in the last years. One of the main reasons for that is Vietnam's early decision to open its borders and discontinue many of the quarantine and lockdown policies, which really helped them to recover faster than other countries in the region. There are also numerous industrial zones, a large workforce, and labor availability, and a young workforce. And these labor costs are relatively cheap compared, especially to China, and even compared to Vietnam, as Mark mentioned. Over the last, say, 20 years, Vietnam has had a continuous track record of high growth and relatively low-cost labor compared to other countries in the region. Next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Alex?
Sure.
Okay. One of the things that has drove a lot of companies to Vietnam is Vietnam's focus on free trade agreements. They currently have 16 different free trade agreements in force, and this is more than anyone else in the region. In addition to these 16 free trade agreements, they are also negotiating 3 additional trade agreements, one with Northern Europe, one with Canada, and one with the UAE. This makes them specifically attractive if you're a larger manufacturer and you need to supply other countries in the region, or even in other regions throughout South America or other regions. Because of these free trade agreements, you can ship goods relatively cheaply with a very little tax on it. Next slide.
There we go.
Alex, next slide. Okay. Because of this, Vietnam has become a second home for a lot of different American companies. Pepsi, Coca-Cola, of course, Intel, Pfizer, Facebook, P&G, like Ashley Furniture and Qualcomm, HP. A lot of companies in a lot of different diverse industries have come to China to take advantage of the free trade agreements and the ability to manufacture at low cost here. Next slide.
Sure. There we go.
Alex, next slide. Okay.
Yep.
There are three main regions within Vietnam where a lot of the manufacturing done. One is in the north, near the Haiphong and Hanoi area. That's primarily heavy industry. In the center of Vietnam, near Da Nang and the Central Coast area, that's primarily light industry and a lot of fishery. And then in the south, it's a very diverse manufacturing near Ho Chi Minh City area, light industry, heavy industry, chemicals, all kinds of things, including attracting a lot of Korean companies, a lot of Japanese companies, and even Chinese companies for their second facilities in Ho Chi Minh City. Next slide.
Here, there you go.
Okay. Oops. Make it. Okay. The main industries that Vietnam has been focusing on are telephones, mobile phones, computers, and electronics. There's a lot of electronics assembly work. In addition to that, there's a lot of garments and textiles, and also the footwear and shoe industry, especially the higher end stuff in that area has been sticking in Vietnam and growing over the last years. In addition, there's a lot of machinery and instrumentation, which is more specialized machines that have been, going up the value chain in Vietnam. And then, of course, furniture and wood products over the last, say, 3 or 4 years has been fighting for number one with China China and Vietnam being the number one producers. And as far as the exports, there's three main markets that take up over half the exports of Vietnam, and that's the United States, which is the main trade partner, and then also China and the EU. And between those three trade partners, that's over half of Vietnam's exports. So it's nothing new for Vietnam to be exporting to the U.S. Next slide.
Jacob, one question we had or popped in already. We've got a company here that says they're looking for sheet metal and CNC machining suppliers in Vietnam. That's something I know we've looked for in the past. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sheet metal, there's definitely a lot of companies doing that. Main consideration with sheet metal work would be the size of the final product. Are those small products or are those very huge, large things? And that'll kind of determine what kind of supplier would be most suitable for you. And then with the CNC equipment, with CNC machining, that also goes down to how complex, what are your tolerances of that, especially if you have simpler machining and very labor intensive. There's a lot of suppliers. As you get into the higher end stuff, the more precision stuff, maybe aerospace, then you have a lot less selection of suppliers that are capable of doing that. But you also have some high end, local companies that are able to do stuff, and then you also have a lot of, especially European companies that have manufacturing facilities in Vietnam that are able to do quite complex stuff.
Okay. Well, for the we can, for the firm that the company, manufacturing company, we can talk to them later on, but the availability of the supply base is there. Okay. Here you go, Jacob. Next slide.
There's just, we just need to understand how complicated. Yeah. And another thing with Vietnam, it's more driven. A lot of the benefits of moving to Vietnam can be driven by the region, the province, or the industrial zone. A lot of the incentives for moving to different regions will be based on what each industrial zone or what each province is trying to encourage in their province. And if you're moving into an industrial zone that is trying to attract your industry, you'll probably have additional benefits as things as tax holidays or additional benefits with your importing your equipment tax-free and other things if you're bringing in industry into their industrial zone that they want. And there's this different regions have different benefits and different industrial zones have different benefits. Next slide.
Sure. So now we're getting ready to go into the case studies. And we're going to start off first with the case study. Jacob is going to handle it's around the U.S. manufacturer was currently producing and was producing in China and packaging in the U.S. and wanted us to see what we can do to help them lower the costs and in their exports to the U.S. So Jacob, if you will take case study number 1.
Yeah, we were working with a U.S. manufacturer of industrial equipment. What they were doing is they were purchasing or manufacturing 100% of their components in China. Then they would ship them to the United States for final assembly, testing, and packaging in the United States. What are the things that they asked us to really look at is, what's, the imported components in the United States. They're paying quite a heavy taxes because they're being all produced in China. And the other one is they wanted us to look at the labor rates and the cost of their assembly work that they were doing in the U.S. One of the first things we looked at to review is they were looking at, should we consider just moving the assembly work into China? Well, we did find people able to do that, and it would be a decent amount of savings by moving that assembly work into China. However, it didn't address our main concern. Our main concern was that 25% duty because the machine would still be made in the U.S. After we looked at that and said that it didn't solve one of our main problems, we looked at, are there other countries in Asia that would be able to produce these machines? So we started a project to look at other countries in Asia. Would they be able to produce these machines? And then we also included Mexico into this because of its proximity to the U.S. In the end, we identified that for this industry, for this specific type of machine, in the past, a lot of these equipment were manufactured in China. Some of them have been moving to Thailand, and even a lot of the manufacturers that were previously in Thailand are now moving to Vietnam. So that really identified Vietnam as a place to be, and we started to look at a project to move the equipment into Mexico or into Vietnam for assembly, and then a localization process over the next 18 months where we'll localize the machine to make it basically made in Vietnam. The main thing that this addressed, one, it addressed the labor rate. Labor in Vietnam is approximately 25% of what it is in China and about 10% of what it is in the United States. So that's a decent amount of savings right there. As we localize the machine over the 18-month period, we start to have the machine made in Vietnam, and that means that we no longer have to pay the anti-dumping tax. And also, because a number of the manufacturers in this industry and supporting manufacturers were already moving into Vietnam, there's a lot of companies that were experienced on this type of machine, and they were also hungry to get business in Vietnam. So there was a lot of companies that were willing to help us localize the machine and provide us parts at very attractive rates. And
Jacob, we had a question that popped up here. Question was, it's a manufacturer here in the U.S. Said, how did East West figure out under this new operational strategy, moving this up to Vietnam, that was qualified for the made in Vietnam and did not still have duties or still have qualified for the China 25% tariffs?
Yeah. In general, what we would look at is generally it needs to be about 50% of the value needs to be Vietnam. That can be labor, that can be research and development, that could be technology. But primarily what we focus on, because it's the most tangible and easy to show and prove to the government, is that we're starting to localize the process and localize different components. Once we're starting to localize those components, we can have a discussion with the local government, and because of the complexity of the machine, they're usually a little bit more flexible on the rate, and maybe you don't have to have quite 50%, because they'll consider the technology that you're transferring in as an additional thing that they want. So they want to encourage you to do that. But it is also, it is less of a top-down approach. So you're going to have to talk with the local government and talk with them about what will be the requirements for this specific machine in this specific industry to be made in Vietnam. But that's a process that you'll get into as you're manufacturing in Vietnam.
Well, Mark, I just on the side note, I know you're doing a lot of stuff on the ground in Thailand. You've got to obviously go through the same process in Thailand. Is it to get them made in Thailand? Is it the same process of Vietnam?
Yeah, it's very similar. And Thailand might be a little bit more organized, but you really have to understand on your bill of material of your components coming in from China to Thailand or Vietnam for that matter. What's the percentage starting from there? Okay, and then what parts can you localize rather quickly? Usually it's fasteners, things like that are not your main components, but then you can localize those. And then once you start adding in, like things like packaging counts, royalties count towards local content, R&D counts, internal freight costs. So both countries want you to come there, and they will help you get to those numbers to get you local content to allow you then to have the duty free if back to the States. So Thailand might be a little bit more organized, but they both kind of have the same model. And then once in the case, the one we're just talking about here, if there's a couple large components, that you can localize quickly, in this case, there's some castings, you can get those localized pretty quickly. Then hitting your numbers becomes much easier. So.
Okay. Good. All right. If you would mind tackling case study number 2, please.
Yeah. So a little bit similar. A client of ours, been working with them. Large multinational facilities in USA, China, Thailand, and Vietnam. Asked us to kind of take a look at their whole kind of a footprint rationalization and how can they streamline things, and with the ultimate goal of reducing costs. So the first thing they really wanted us to look at was the China facility and how we might be able to absorb what's going on in China into Thailand and Vietnam, and again with the idea of reduced costs, and by moving some stuff out of China, reduce our duties back to the States, because most of the consumption for wherever they produce was back in the States. So we had to take a look at their existing facilities. They had 3 in Thailand and 1 in Vietnam to determine the suitability to absorb what they were doing in China into the existing facilities. After we did that, on the ground study and did the due diligence, Vietnam was kind of a clear winner for a couple reasons. One, they had capacity or excess capacity, and they had skill set, so that could help absorb the production of these products from China. During our due diligence on the facilities, and particularly in Vietnam, we were able to to help them improve their production and workflow. And then while doing that, it was able to keep in our minds, we're going to be bringing these new products in from China. So we were able to help them reconfigure their manufacturing operations to more efficiently absorb what they were doing in China in Vietnam. And also on the due diligence to determine, as far as suppliers, how, what suppliers do they have? Are they available to help work on these new products, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Vietnam is, as Jacob mentioned earlier, was really attractive. So what it allowed us to do was close one of their facilities in China, and then begin to move some of the equipment from that facility to Vietnam to set up, which again helps us then with local content. In addition, we went out and found not only the existing suppliers, but new suppliers who could help us with local content to produce these new products that moving in from China. And the short of the story is we were able to meet the 50% local content made in Vietnam and be able to ship to the United States with no duties, which is where most of their consumption was. So similar to the prior one, moving stuff out of China, localizing in Vietnam, taking advantage of lower labor, and taking advantage of the duty status once you get local content. So we're very successful project.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll now go from the projects into the Q&A discussion. These are the questions we've gotten already that we got provided by the registrants who are on today prior to today's webinar. Obviously, we've had three questions already asked during. Again, anyone to join, you can ask questions anytime. So we've gotten in some questions here. As we'll go down these questions with the registrants in, and then I've got two more that just popped up. Again, if you are on there, you go to control panel, hit questions, and send us a question, and we'll ask the participants. So let's just kind of move through these questions that we got from the registrants here. I guess the first one about why and how U.S. companies are developing manufacturing, contract manufacturing, sourcing capabilities in Vietnam. Mark, why don't you discuss it if you would?
Well, I mean, it's just we kind of, as we talked about in a couple of these case studies, if you're doing a lot of business back in the States, that's where your end products are going. And if you're in China today, and as Alex, as you said earlier, the duties probably are not going to go away, right? We've had them now through two administrations, right? So you begin to look for areas that maybe are more labor competitive, like China was 30 years ago, and maybe look for areas where you don't have the duty situation like China was 30 years ago. And Vietnam is one that's really opened up. I mean, I date myself. I was there the weekend we lifted the embargo. President Clinton lifted the embargo in '93. So I mean, they've really, and then of course Jacob's there now, so he's really on top of things. But yeah, I mean, it's gone, this really gone up the sophistication channel from just making, socks and garments 25, 30 years ago to LEDs and sophisticated products. So Vietnam is and as with also the free trade agreements that Jacob showed, you can do a lot of business. And Vietnam has been very aggressive and quite successful. So.
All right. Are there certain sectors, you and Jacob can answer, are there certain sectors where you find that the best place to manufacture in Vietnam, best place to source components out of Vietnam? Are there certain sectors where you definitely want to move into Vietnam, as well as are there certain sectors to stay away from? And Jacob talked earlier about the slide about Vietnam, about certain industry sectors like electronics and phones and furniture and machinery. But are there certain sectors you find that are very successful for sourcing in Vietnam and manufacturing in Vietnam?
Recently, a lot of electronics and electronics assembly has really been moving to China or to Vietnam very aggressively. But beyond that, there's still the traditional areas that are, just standard machining parts, standard stamp parts, standard assembly work, CNC stuff. There's a lot of stuff there, and a lot of companies are just looking at, if the labor content is quite high, there's usually some opportunities for them, and there are suppliers in most areas. It's just you just have to look quite carefully, and you have to understand what you're looking for to find the right opportunity.
Mark, would you add anything into that, or?
No, I think it's, what Jacob said is, you got the three major regions, and I mean, some of them there, and then Jacob, can we talk a little bit about this from a geographic standpoint? If you are going to bring a lot of components in from China, then being up north, up by the Chinese border, and with the highway system, it really makes it You can bring stuff in until you get localized, and maybe in some parts you never localize because of the cost is so competitive in China. So if you're near a couple of the highways up north of Hanoi, and you can be 6-8 hours from your suppliers in China, also a pretty competitive project
Yeah,
to work
that's one of the things with Haifeng that's really made them quite aggressive, is that you could basically ship goods from China in about 6 or 8 hours, and you can have your goods from Shenzhen to Haifeng and ready to assemble the next day in your electronics assembly factory,
Yeah.
which is quite an advantage.
It really is that way. I mean, I know people, if some things you want to localize, then it makes a lot of sense. But in some cases, you have developed in China for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe some suppliers in the Shenzhen, southern area that are world class cost, world class quality. And if you can continue to use those in China and then bring them into Vietnam and take advantage of the duty situation and even lower labor costs for assembly, really a good model.
Yeah, are there certain challenges in Vietnam, Jacob? I'm looking at question number 4. One of the participants asked about, are there certain unique challenges? I assume they're referring to both sourcing or manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unique challenges because a lot of companies are used to what's happening in China, but China's quite mature. China has had Western companies working in the Chinese companies for 30 years. So they're quite mature, and they know the industries that they're working in. They're quite well. One of the things in Vietnam is there's a lot of industries where the factories aren't very mature. They're going to need some assistance. That is often comes down to East West providing some of that local assistance and providing assistance between the client in the U.S. and the client and the factory in China and Vietnam to understand, what are the quality expectations, what are the processes, what needs to get done to meet the requirements. Which China's already had 30 years of training, and Vietnam's maybe had 0 to 5 to 10 years of training on this. So it really depends on the industry.
Yeah, I know you and I were talking about another client of ours who were trying to get equipment into Vietnam. It's technically not allowed, but was allowed.
Yeah, yeah, and there, I mean, that's another one of, a lot of things are very regional. One things that we've seen is, you're not supposed to be able to import used equipment, but sometimes we can negotiate with the local government, and they will allow us to import used equipment. Another time, it's supposed to be 50% for your local content to get your certificate that it's made in Vietnam. But sometimes you can negotiate with the local government, and they will say, okay, your machine is good technology. We're happy to have you here. So we only need you to have 30% local content, and we'll declare that your machine is made in Vietnam, which is, less flexible than what you'll see in Thailand.
Yeah, so when you look at Thailand, I'm looking at question 5 here around how Vietnam's compared with Thailand on lease rates, building costs, but also the advantages of the industrial zones, because doing the industrial zones in Vietnam and Thailand seem to be quite different. Mark, can you tackle that? Jacob, tackle that?
Let me handle that one. I think we've tackled it just in Thailand and in 5 of the largest industrial zones in the Rayong, Chonburi, Pad Thai area. So, I mean, there's pros and cons. We've already talked about labor a little bit. Labor basically in Vietnam is kind of called half of Thailand and a third of what China is. Lease rates very comparable. We're working on another project right now where the lease rates they're paying in China and in Thailand, they're about the same, and in Vietnam a little bit less. Actually, in some cases, Vietnam's a little more difficult they don't have quite the real estate of existing facilities as much if you want to move in to an existing facility as we do in Vietnam, as we do in Thailand. And then building costs some are kind of on par. But as Jacob said, it's both countries you have to kind of approach a little bit differently. In Vietnam, You got to be really on the ground, working hard and locally with the provinces and the industrial zones, because they do things more on a regional basis. Thailand has a if they want to attract certain industries, they do it from the national level, not the park level, not the province level. They do it from the R&D level, and if you can fit into one of their things that they're really trying to attract, it becomes very convenient, because you don't have to do it by park, by region, by province. You do it by central government in Bangkok. And once you get signed off on that, there's no games that can get played, ever, because the central government's involved. So I would say the big difference is in Vietnam, you need to really be on the ground locally, working with provinces and parks and regions. And in Bangkok or Thailand, you need to be on the ground as well, but you start in Bangkok and then it goes from there down to the industrial zones and parks.
That's helpful. We had a question that popped up. Someone just sent a question which says, we talked earlier about the tariffs, and the question was, how likely could Vietnam be subjected to the Section 301 tariffs we have now in China?
Yeah, I would say in 2019 and 2020 there was a little bit of a risk. I'd say right now, especially with the recent visit of Biden to Vietnam and basically the United States going to a higher level partnership with Vietnam, I say right now it's extremely low risk that anything's going to happen.
Good.
So I don't think you're going to see the same type of tariffs or taxes between Vietnam and the U.S.
So on slide question number 6, someone that sent us was about summarizing the trade relations, tariff policies. You don't think that Vietnam is going to get that Section 301 tariffs? No, the trade policies, trade relations, pretty good. I guess Biden was just there 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and we just went from basically, we now raised up to their highest level of trade partnership. And we've gotten past some problems in 2019, 2020 with some transshipments out of China that the Vietnam government aggressively stopped. And, that stopped the risk of this type of tariffs. And, basically Vietnam has had a bilateral agreement with the United States for about 20 years. And when that bilateral agreement went into effect, basically the average tariff went from 40% to 3%. So right now, most things that you're shipping out of Vietnam are quite low or no tariff.
So when we have, and I'm looking here, question number 8 there about metrics. And metrics really was talking about, Mark, maybe the best first answer this, but if a company is looking to determine in ASEAN and Vietnam or Thailand, or what metrics should they be using to look at what is the best country for them in the site selection? If they're looking at establishing an operation there, what metrics should they be using?
Well, I mean,
they go through this.
Yeah, a lot depends. For example, if you want to go there and establish, a manufacturing facility, build your own building, you got to look at, manufacturing costs. You have to look at, is there the support there that can help build your building to your specifications? Or if you want to get an existing building, is there buildings there that you can lease and lease back, or build to suit and lease back? Those are things you want to look at. I mean, we all know about labor rates and things of that nature. You also want to take a look at ease of doing business. Take a look at some of the if you have the corruption index, take a look at that. But there's not. I mean, it's like, if you're going to go into any country, what's the duties, what's the labor rates, what's the labor availability, a critical thing you have to look at, labor skill set, things of that nature, ability to import and export. So I don't know if the metrics are actually unique to Vietnam or Thailand or any other place. It's good business practices in any country you go to look at 6, 8, 10 different variables.
We just got a question in. Thank you, Mark. And kind of that we just got a question in from a company that is currently manufacturing electronics, and for the question, they currently source out of China, looking now at Vietnam for identifying suppliers. They were asking around for Vietnam in particular, obviously they're comparing that to China. This company looks like from the question you can tell they did this probably 15 years ago, right when they went to China, identified suppliers, qualified suppliers. When they now want to do this in Vietnam, Jacob, you talk a little bit about the difference. They're asking are there differences in the electronic supply chain base in Vietnam? Now, obviously, the size of it is going to be different. But when you're identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, same process in Vietnam. Any uniqueness there?
Yeah, all the process is the same. The difference is, what suppliers are available in the market. In some things, you'll have less options available, and you'll have less mature suppliers available. And then sometimes also you'll need to look at some of the foreign companies that are coming in doing electronics assembly, just because maybe with the local suppliers they don't fit your needs. So it's a lot of it really depends on what industry are you doing, how complex is the items that you're doing, and then we're looking through your BOM, see how complicated are the subcomponents, and looking at how many suppliers are available. And once we look at those suppliers, we have to look at, are they suitable, and how much work would it take to help them be more mature and fit your needs.
So they actually just texted, the second question would said that, is it fair to assume then that there's more supplier improvement work you have to do with Vietnamese suppliers than you did in China?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're going with local suppliers, local suppliers, they've had less experience than the suppliers that are in China that have been trained by Western companies for the last 30 years. But there are a number of these companies that were previously in China already in Vietnam, and they can do very complex work, but their pricing will be a bit higher because they are far more complex operations. So usually what we're looking at is we're looking at the local options, and do the local options suit you? And if the local options don't suit you, then we start looking at some of the more international options, and if those are more suited to your need.
Yeah, let me just kind of jump in. If for those on the call, I mean, if you're familiar with what you had to do in China back in the 90s, would be somewhat similar as far as getting these, but I think we're going to be able to ramp up much quicker because the fact that there are some Chinese sub-assembly suppliers and things that are now down in Vietnam that have been trained, and then they have moved down. And as we talked about a little earlier, if you're up in the north and you are having difficulty maybe finding some good local suppliers, you're only 6-8 hours away if you have good ones in the Shenzhen, Guangdong area. So, you have to kind of mix and match a little bit. But I think, as we ramped up China 35 years ago, and it took, look what's happened in the last 35 years with infrastructure and airports and seaports and sophistication. It can be done, and Vietnam is on that path. They're just going to be much smaller, obviously, 70 million people versus 80 million people versus 1.3 billion. But I think the ramp up will be quicker than it was in China.
Yeah, and a lot of companies they come in at first, and they're relying on their Chinese suppliers as they develop their local Vietnamese supplier. I mean, it might take them a year before the Vietnamese supplier is able to fully supply, and then during that time, they're going to be relying on their previous Chinese supplier. And then, as the Vietnamese supplier is more qualified and able to produce the parts, then they'll start taking over a percentage of that business.
Sure.
So this company was asking on the electronic side, their assumption is that the reason why Vietnam and the electronic sector is as strong as it is primarily because logistics plays such a small role in getting these products back to the U.S., right? So if that's the case, you can produce and take advantage of the labor costs of Vietnam. your logistics costs, so you don't get eaten up, and therefore you're not necessarily having to look to Mexico. And what
Yeah,
is
a
that
lot of the
correct?
logistics cost is moving around the subcomponents, not moving the final product. Final product is generally fairly economical to move, but moving a lot of small components around Asia, you know, that's why a lot of companies are sticking in Asia, because they need some parts from China, they need some parts from Korea, they need some parts from Japan, they need some parts from Philippines. So, you know, if they did that in Mexico, it's quite a challenge to work out the logistics to get all those parts from different parts of Asia into Mexico at the right time to assemble them.
Okay, so a question came in from a company in the medical sector. They were looking at asking around packaging and kind of consolidated. They're sourcing products from Vietnam. What is the warehousing situation in kind of three areas in Ho Chi Minh and Da Nang and Hanoi? If you're looking for good warehouses to do consolidation and the packaging and the shipping, I know we've done quite a amount of work in that space. There are a number of warehousing 3PLs in that area to be able to do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of options. I would say, especially in the more Hanoi area and the Ho Chi Minh City area, Da Nang area, you'd be more limited in options. But there are options in every place, and it would just you know, come down to, you know, what do you really need? Are you looking for distribution, just simple consolidation? Are you looking for simple assembly, a very complex assembly? Then at that, you know, if it's complex assembly, maybe the warehouse wouldn't be suitable. So you might want to work with a local factory to do that assembly work for you. But there's a lot of options, and it just really depends on what is your specific situation and how complex is the machine and raw materials that you're dealing with.
So the assumption there would be the warehousing costs in Vietnam will be somewhat similar to what's in Thailand, I'm assuming. But I guess it depends on the
Yeah,
type of warehouse and what you're asking to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
yeah.
yeah,
Especially, it sounded like they were looking at for A-level warehouses. So,
Yeah.
you know, A-level warehouses are going to be, you know, a bit more expensive in every market, and you know, they're going to be more consistent across markets.
Certainly.
yeah.
One of the questions that we got here was talking about on question number 11 that the registrant had sent in earlier about kind of the financial and operational incentives as the Vietnamese government provide to foreign companies who are looking to establish their own operations, whether they're leased or whether they're wholly owned. Can you get into that a little bit, please? Jacob, that would be for you.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
okay.
yeah,
Well, there are a number of financial incentives. There's you know, there's some incentives for tax holidays. There's some incentives also for reducing the taxes or waiving the taxes for the land rights. You know, there are a number of incentives, and of course, when you talk about Vietnam, it's going to be more down to the provincial level and also to the industrial park level of what benefits they have also negotiated with the government to offer to you, and that'll be dependent on your industry and the size of your facility and what you're actually doing.
Okay. And Mark, I think you talked earlier about that is it's a different from Thailand, which is a little more formalistic, a little more organized.
yeah, yeah. You know, again, there's sometimes there's tax incentives, sometimes there's, investment incentives. Are you putting in design centers? Are you putting in test labs? How many engineers are you hiring? How much, that's that sort of stuff. Those kind of things. And as I said, everyone wants to get to the same place. That is, as you can. And the government's, if you can get on the list of stuff that Jacob mentioned that they really want to have, then you're kind of in the driver's seat. If you're just, I mean, everyone, people have to remember now, Vietnam is getting more sophisticated, and we've had clients. I should say, we had clients that had, this is 10 years ago, 8 years ago, that were doing pretty basic stuff in the construction industry, roofing screws. And Thailand said, "Hey, Mark, this is Board of Investment said this is nice, but this isn't really for us." We went to Vietnam. Vietnam said, "Yeah, we would like this," but this is 6 years ago. That same business now in Vietnam making just a labor-intensive screw may not be as attractive as electronics and things of that nature. So you in both countries, but we're talking here about Vietnam, you really need to fit what you're doing with what the government wants, and then you're in a good position to adapt and adjust to maximize your benefits.
Well, if you talked about time, and that was 6 years ago, and I remember that project. When just looking out over the next 3 to 5 years, can you all talk about what you see as far as in this question 12, really on the Vietnam labor, the ports, the airports, also kind of as far as kind of geopolitical comments on Vietnam, because it's obviously getting a lot more attention now as people are spending more and more time there, both on sourcing and manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, especially like the labor market, Vietnam does have a young population, so there's a lot of new people coming into the labor market all the time. So that's a big advantage there. And one of the things you are seeing though is a lot of companies and a lot of people moving up the value chain, moving from basic garment manufacture to electronics assembly. So if you're doing higher value stuff, you're probably going to have a little bit of an advantage there, because it's getting harder to do the very basic garment stuff in Vietnam, because they're not really wanting to attract that. As far as ports, there's a number of ports and airports that are under construction and planned. Really what the government's been pushing a lot now is different industrial zones. So they have a place for the new factories coming in, and that over the next 3 to 5 years will increase. There'll be new ports, there'll be new airports, and there'll be new industrial zones, which will have new benefits for different industries.
Let me ask you a question on that point around the labor employees. The question popped up as far as the availability to get skills that qualified employees. The person was saying, making the assumption there's a large number of blue collar employees, but how hard is it to get? How hard is it to get? This company doesn't have a manufacturing plant, but they want to source from there, so they want to look at setting up a sourcing office. How hard is it for them to get qualified quality control engineers and qualified technicians?
Yeah, I mean, quality control, I haven't had any problems of hiring people for quality control stuff. For some technical fields, at times I'd had factories that had problems recruiting enough, machinists, tool makers, stuff like that. Sometimes there is a shortage in that area, and it really depends on what specifically industry are you working in, and what specific skills are you looking for. There are people available in the market, and some things are harder to find than others.
That certainly, I guess, depending on what sector you're in and where you are in Vietnam. And the last question was on the supply chain base. As far as going in and talking to suppliers and getting information on them, this first question was around obviously China. You have to be real careful who you're talking to, what kind of suppliers, because they may also own other suppliers, and you don't know if they're. But there's a little bit of lack of transparency. Can you find, when you're trying to source from work with a Vietnamese supplier, can you do background checks on them to find out who owns them, and do they own other suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot more transparent than it is in China. Some things, when you're working with some of the factories in the north, in some of the industries, it is not as extreme as in China, but it is a little bit the same, that some of the large industries are private, but they're very government related. You know, a lot of the factories that we work with, especially with smaller manufacturers, would be down in the south, and that in the south is very less frequent.
Right. Okay. Okay. Look, I know we've got one final question. I know it's 12 o'clock, so we said we kept you for an hour. So those who have to hop off, please feel free to hop off. We did have a final question, and someone just reiterated on the register, was asking about question number 10 about they're looking to relocate their operation, kind of similar to our case study on number 1, from China to relocate it to Vietnam. And they had a question about number 10, but what if they were to close their operation in China, what would that look like? What are the problems that they likely can anticipate? So we'll answer that question. If anyone has to hop off, please feel free to do so. This concludes it. But Mark, if you would mind going ahead and saying.
Sure. So I'll give a quick. So there's kind of two things you have to look at. There's the legal stuff to close an entity in China and to do it correctly. You know, as far as the lease, the building, the equipment, getting the facility back in place, the severance of the employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the financial piece you got to close out, which is, you know, your tax situation, you know, your VAT, all that sort of stuff, because you want to do it legally and correctly, particularly if you still have other facilities there, or if you want to ever come back. But then also you have to take into the commercial piece of it and understand, okay, are you creating a competitor now if you're leaving there? How about your suppliers that you've got on board and you move out, and do you bring some with you? How do you manage it so you don't create a competitor, and maybe you can turn some of those suppliers into partners with you down in say in Vietnam or Thailand, but in this case Vietnam. So it's something that you want to really look at closely from a facility operational tax standpoint, and then on the commercial side, you know, you don't want to create competitors, you don't want to do things of that nature. How much IP has been exposed? Can you turn those into maybe potential partners and going south? So something you want to spend a lot of time on and look at, but it's manageable if you have the right people on the ground to kind of help you organize all that.
Yeah, I mean, I know we just recently closed 2 factories in China, and that HR piece is a critical piece of that as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, look, I will appreciate you. I just want to get that final question that came in. This concludes today's webinar on Vietnam. Please feel free to send us any questions. We can answer those offline. Thank you all for taking the time, and please feel free to join us on our future webinars. Mark and Jacob, thank you all for your time and expertise.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks.